Welcome. Financing renewable energy in Africa. Faster, bigger, better. That's the title of our session. Amit, why don't we start with you?
Yes.
Since this is a finance panel.
Yes.
Tell me, what do you, let's not rehearse the long history of the energy transition. I mean, I promise my audience no long-winded speeches. If we can cut to the quick, here we are today at a moment that could be seen as a bit of an inflection point. We've seen it in South Africa with a takeoff in renewables recently, but more broadly on the African scale. What do you see from the perspective of Nedbank works in terms of financing renewable energy, and what more do we need to see?
Yeah, thank you, Vijay, and really happy to be here this morning with you and your audience. So the energy and the renewable energy conundrum that we have in the continent, it's been slow. But I think we all know that 600 million Africans are in excess of electricity. So we have a three thing: energy security, affordability, and transition. We know the impact of carbon and environmental has a huge impact on the continent, although we were not one of the largest emitters in the world, but the impact is really great. So I think everyone appreciates it, and we know the contribution of energy in terms of the transition and the carbon agenda. So energy projects in the continent, South Africa has been great. We've really done well in terms of our energy transition and plans. We can do more, but I think we're in the right settings and things are working well. But the rest of the continent, we've seen the slow rollout of renewable energy projects. For many reasons: political instability, procurement, grid access, lack of investors taking political risk, currency convertibility, be able to fund projects in local currency. And fundamentally, where the disconnect is that most consumers in the continent still can't afford to pay for electricity. So the collections is still a huge problem in the continent to have a sustainable long procurement of renewable energy. But where we see lots of traction happening in the corporate space in the continent, where large corporates are doing it for their own consumption, for their own carbon emission reduction programs, and to go green. So that's really working well, where captive small corporate industrial power purchase agreements are done. But in the large scale, utility scale for the rest of the continent, it's still very slow. West Africa, we have lots of gas power.
Right.
East Africa, we have potential for huge geothermal, but still untouched. We have lots of smaller projects. Southern Africa, except for South Africa, it's still a bit slow. We know hydro is still a big determination for Mozambique, for example, in Malawi. We've seen lots of green hydrogen efforts in Namibia, but it's there. I think we're seeing some small seeds being planted, but really it's not germinating at the pace that we would like it to be.
You mentioned a few obstacles in passing, having to do with really perceived risks or actual risks on the ground, right? There's a fascinating new study that the Clean Air Task Force has put out. Actually, we'll have a speaker from Clean Air Task Force on the next session, but that looked at the weighted average cost of capital across Africa and calculated it was over 15%, certainly much higher than you would find in the developed world, and certainly extraordinarily high given the potential for renewables is extraordinary here, right? The cost of solar and batteries have collapsed to very attractive levels now. In fact, cheaper to build new solar than new coal almost everywhere in the world. In the US, very soon it'll be cheaper than new gas, according to the IEA. And yet we're finding these obstacles in the form of financing. You've laid out a couple of the examples of risk, and I'm going to ask the same question for all three of you, gentlemen, but I'll let you weigh in before we move on.
Yeah.
What do we do about that cost of capital?
So as I said, there's no limitations. Investors want to build projects. Independent power producers have huge desires and ambition and mandates to build projects in the continent. If you look what's happening in North Africa, mega projects in Egypt, in Morocco, that's really working well. So the IPPs want to do. Me as an investment banker, Nedbank, we want to put our capital there. Really, it's a big mandate from our board to do it. The development finance institutions have huge mandates to develop impact lending and to grow this. But unfortunately, the structure in which we've done independent power producers and PPPs in the continent may be not the right model. I think that may be failed because to have long-term offtake agreements with government guarantees, it's failed us. And that's the biggest impediment as we speak. So I think we need to re-engineer the model that we are doing to roll out projects in the rest of the continent and find a new mechanism to roll it at space.
Okay, so that's a challenge to my remaining two speakers. Maybe I'll come to you, Ziad, for a moment to give a counterpoint, because we've heard about sort of the corporate investments that have come. But the work that you do at GIAP, you focus a lot on off-grid solutions, on renewables at smaller scale. Can you give us a sense of that has always been the great prospect and hope, but it has also been slower moving than many people had wanted. What is the reality check on off-grid renewables, distributed solar, microgrids? Give us a pulse of what's happening in that area.
Yeah, so thank you. I think there's a lot of momentum and tailwinds because of the cost reductions and technology advancements that you referred to. And we're seeing progress, but it's relatively slow. Like this still, as the previous panelist said, 600 million people who need to be electrified. And what's quite specific about the African context is you have dispersed rural populations, smaller economies that you can't necessarily move with utility scale projects. So off-grid solar home systems, microgrids are essentially the key instrument technology that we need to develop. I think there's two things that are possibly holding that back. The first one is, if you look at the project developer landscape, there's really a lot of fragmentation. It's very difficult for a developer to access continued funding from the early stage feasibility study all the way to project prep to project development. And that really drives up the transaction costs. From a GIA perspective, one of the things we're looking at is how do you actually bring all the funding together? We're part of an initiative now called Mission 300, led by the World Bank and AFDB, supported by Rockefeller and SE Fuel as well. Which aims to electrify 300 million people by 2030.
This is the Mission 300 initiative,
yes.
Am I right?
Yeah, that's really important to support governments, both with the technical assistance for the planning and the technology solutions, as well as coupled with the project finance. Because I think what we find often in the African context is you actually have a lot of financing commitments, but the utilization of that finance is relatively low. One other point that I'll make that's quite specific to the context of how to apply off-grid solutions, something we find is you have a lot of subscale projects. And when you talk to investors, it's just that the projects are too small and it's essentially not worth their while to invest in these smaller projects. So one of the key things that also need when you start looking at is aggregation, how to build a lot of these smaller projects into larger portfolios. Just to give a couple of examples of how this could work. The one is really these are homogeneous projects, so looking at standardization, incredibly important, both in terms of how do you match make investors with project developers, but also the process points that drive the transaction cost, the documentation, the resources, the project monitoring can really benefit from standardization. And then the other area that's really driving costs when you have these fragmented developers across the continent in rural areas is the equipment costs. And again, to the point of aggregation, pooling equipment purchases, we've seen examples where you can actually bring down the cost significantly. One of the platforms that we run called DART, Demand Aggregation for Renewable Technology, found that you can get 30% savings on equipment for distributed renewable energy systems by pooling purchases in West and East Africa.
Well, this trend towards trying to standardize and to maybe bundle these projects seems very promising because, again, especially with the smaller projects you're talking about, even with some of the bigger projects, it is very hard for investors, the pools of capital, the deep pools that are coming from the big institutional funds around the world, to be able to focus on individual projects or even smaller countries in Africa. On the Economist stage last year, I had one of the senior figures at BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, $9 trillion plus in money, and they have a commitment to low carbon investing. They have a thesis on the energy transition. But this gentleman was extremely frank. He said, we even have a very sizable fund done in partnership with some development banks, a significant amount of money that we put in looking for projects, clean energy projects in the developing world. And he said, look, honestly, we found it really hard to disperse the funds. Why? He's sitting in New York. He's thinking about billions and trillions of dollars. It doesn't move the needle. The little projects are not material for him or his team. Of course, they have the number of countries we have to look after, the complexity of the projects, the individual project risk, rule of law, institutional risk. It's just too much. He was being quite frank, actually, surprisingly frank, saying, I don't think we're going to be able to get this money where most of it needs to go. This is the wrong mechanism. So if we can find ways through innovative finance for bundling, the way, for example, the commercial real estate market developed REITs, which were a very effective institution for bundling assets, managing risk, it seems like that would be a promising direction to go. Let me come to you, Chris. What do you think about this idea of finding some new mechanisms that would give investors some simplicity and perhaps hide the complexity or provide risk diversification within the portfolio? What are your thoughts? And I know you've worked across Asia as well. Maybe you can help sharpen the pencil for us a little bit on what are differences in other markets that might be more advanced.
Okay. Firstly, thank you very much and for inviting me to this event. I've heard my two fellow panelists give different perspective, and I think there's a lot there to unpack. I guess when I look at what we do, so we finance projects across the continent of Africa. We've been doing it for 76 years. So we have a variety of experience around financing solutions. But I think one important thing is the generalization. We can't generalize Africa as one. So I think any solution you look to bring in to finance renewable, you've got to look at it.
Your mic is
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. I think you've got to look at it from the perspective of the region. So in terms of bundling, as you referenced, I guess it's more around.
Just look straight. Don't look at me.
Okay.
I think it's a directional mic. Yeah.
Okay. I think in terms of bundling, the way I look at it is around programs. So as investors like ourselves, we invest across a range of solar home system to utility scale. So we need to be flexible in terms of how we apply our capital, as well as how we bring commercial investors like BlackRock and others into the continent. So where you have governments that have clear programs in place, and if I look at the example of what we've done in South Asia, India, for example, the government in India came out with a very clear plan of a vision for 2030 to get nearly 200 gigawatts of electricity onto their grid. So that meant on an annual basis, there was a particular target of need for renewables onto their grid. So for investors like ourselves and others, predictability is very important because you're able to allocate capital, you're able to find developers that are then willing to come into particular markets to then develop these projects. So where governments are able to put a clear program, a clear schedule of what the opportunities are, you can then attract the substantial capital. And we've seen that in India. You know, we set up a company in India in 2017 to specifically focus on helping the Indian government get to their targets on renewables. And today, that company is now delivering circa 5 gigawatts of electricity across wind and solar in India. And that's in 2017, 2018 is when we set that company up. If I now look into Africa, in Africa today, we own 70% in a company that I would say is the largest power developer in Africa, a company called Globalec. That company has been around for nearly 20 years. But if I look at what that company has delivered today, it's half what the company that we set up in 2017 in India has done. And the real issue is around in Africa and some of the big countries, there just isn't enough predictable plans of when projects are coming to market and therefore when you can then allocate capital to use. Now, let me take a step back and say, okay, where has it gone well? And what are the lessons that we can use to try and bring more capital to market? South Africa, albeit I know some of you here will think it's relatively slow. If I look at it relative to the continent, the REAP program has been a relative success in terms of getting planned megawatts onto the grid. There's a clear documentation, there's a clear program generally, and investors like ourselves and others come into a market like South Africa, at least understanding that there's a framework and there's a schedule. Compare that to the other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it's very much on an ad hoc basis. So it's market like that where the big pool of capital are just not able to commit to because they can go to other regions to deploy capital. So I think as a capital provider, it's really around understanding the specificity of markets, picking where, for example, you can focus your big pool of capital like we do in South Africa. We also do similar in Egypt. That's another part of the continent where there are big programs for renewable and they are working to some level of a schedule. Compared to what we did last year where we invested, for example, in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, we spent probably about 10 or 12 years working with a developer to develop a project there. Not many investors have that patience or that tenacity to wait that long to develop projects. Now, the capital we put to use was less than $10 million. Again, not sizable in relation to the
But you leveraged it presumably, right?
But yeah, indeed, yeah. So just to give you a feel, so I
Yeah.
think it's about
Agreed.
understanding your market and
Yeah.
then deciding how you put your.
That's very instructive, and I appreciated the international comparison. Let me press on that a little bit, because India is actually one of the great success stories in renewables. Even though there are some similarities between the Indian condition and many African countries, obviously there are costs of doing business, local knowledge, the questions about corruption and so on, or at least inefficiency, the license rods, the infamous bureaucracy that's involved in India in meddling in what the companies do. And yet they've been able to have one of the most successful renewable programs to come up in emerging markets in the last 20 years. Companies like Renew, Greenco, others are real innovators, in part because of policy. World-class auctions, for example, that they initiated with solar, now with clean firm power auctions that have recently started, among the lowest solar prices in the world. So we do see an opportunity there. But I want to see if there is a lesson we can bring back to Africa from that. One thing the Indian government did, they do also have distribution utilities. Many of the states have bankrupt state energy boards, right? The local utilities that are run by the states. And the central bank provided guarantees so that IPPs or investors would have a backstop. One of the questions that was on this, I thought, very good question, was providing central bank guarantees is expensive for African countries, obviously. That has to be accounted for. The IMF credit rating agencies take a look at that, and it might crowd out the opportunity for using those resources for something else. Do you have an idea, Chris, or anyone else on this stage to answer our questioner from the floor? Is that the way forward? Are there alternatives? Because again, when you have a dysfunctional or semi-functional marketplace where investors need that reassurance, it is very helpful to have that kind of sovereign guarantee or backstop facility that may never be tapped, but it doesn't come for free. And what do we do in a region where capital is challenged?
So maybe I can start,
Sure,
Vijay.
why don't you jump in?
So firstly, you can understand almost all the utilities are bankrupt in Africa, as you mentioned in India, the state boards.
Right.
And the second thing, we have huge political risk layered on top of that.
Yeah.
So ultimately, you need some form of sovereign guarantees, but also that's getting very weak and far and few. So I think the real challenge for us, we know there's lots of impact lending from the World Bank, all the huge multinational agencies that they want to support the continent in the transition. So can't we create a huge fund that provides a first-class position to support these countries in the energy programs, some coordinated program from the United Nations or some task force to do something in terms of the continent. And I think that can provide the necessary insurance to attract both private capital and DFI capital into the states.
Okay, well, so that's it. I asked for a concrete idea, so I appreciate that. I'm sure there'll be 10 reasons why that won't work, or somebody will challenge the impracticality, but I want to encourage innovation. So some form of first dollar loss facility. Please, you have an idea, Ziad?
Yeah, so sovereign guarantees dominates a lot of the discussions we have in South Africa. And I think fundamentally when you engage international institutions like MIGA, a lot of it comes down to this state of credit ratings across the continent.
Yeah.
And that is a big bottleneck. So there is a broader global financing architecture discussion around how do we look at risk or assess risk in Africa. But while that's happening, and that will probably take many years to reform, there are ways to look at, especially when you look at more decentralized energy systems, look at alternative credit enhancements. I think one of the things is there's a lot of different blended finance type of instruments being trialed. But there are also like new ways to be creative. Carbon credits offers an additional revenue stream. I'm a bit intimidated to go into detail on carbon credits after the last panel, but there are examples. I think it's the Lake Turkana project in Kenya generates around $7 million of additional revenue from carbon credits. Another very specific problem to the African context, which we've been looking at, is local currency financing. It's a massive bottleneck for distributed renewable energy projects, especially in West Africa because of the currency risk. So also, how do you use grant capital or philanthropic capital to blend and unlock international finance pools by providing local currency facilities for distributed developers? But I'll end up by saying, like, the key thing is just we need to think about how we assess risk in the African continent.
Pick up on that, especially if you could talk a little bit about the risk involved with the foreign currency. A lot of the capital is coming in dollarized or in foreign currency. There has been a proposal from the World Economic Forum and Columbia University for providing a form of insurance product. It would, of course, require some sort of donor or concessional finance to get it going. but to deal at least with the Forex risk portion of investment. Doesn't get rid of all the risk, but I wonder if an idea like that or something similar could work. And what's your more general take on what you've just heard?
Yeah, I'll probably summarize it in 3 points. So I think, and again, linking it to the practicalities in terms of what I'm saying, I think one of the biggest challenges for a lot of the governments have been around the FX liability associated with power purchase agreements. So what I'm seeing, some of the development finance institutions and some of the credit agencies that they're doing, they're setting up guaranteed companies. So essentially companies that can stand behind some of the offtake agreements that governments have done and basically offer local currency solutions. An example in 2 specific countries, in Nigeria, there's a entity called InfraCredit, which has been set up. And that essentially is basically providing some level of guarantee for developers with regards to development of power. So I do think there is an opportunity for more guarantee structures to help, government in terms of bringing more renewables online. I think the second one, and actually I've just come from Zambia, is around opening up power pools, allowing developers to go and have bilateral engagements with commercial or industrial off-takers, and using that as a way of them guaranteeing and mitigating some of their off-take risk, while still able to provide general power to general utilities. And I think the third one, which I think is one I continue to press on developers, which is around picking countries where there is a rule of law. There are tried and tested IPP developed in there, and you're not needing actual government sovereign guarantees. Majority of the countries in our continent in Africa are under IMF programs. So therefore, the obligation of government on guarantees are very much something that they are finding difficult to do. So we have to be innovative in terms of the financial solutions that we put forward to use. So blended finance is definitely one I'm seeing more of in terms of first loss capital.
One last question. I'll let any of you answer that has a specific point of view on this. We had a question from the Slido asking about transmission, that you can't simply keep adding renewables without thinking about the grid. And are there mechanisms that work or that need to be adopted, including here in South Africa? This is going to be a challenge that will boost investment in transmission. What needs to change to encourage that? Of course, it's distinct from investing in solar farm.
So I think one big model that most governments in the continent is a PPP, public-private partnership, private capital, private skills to help them build this. And of course, we know the agenda that they want to keep it as a nationalized grid and transfer it at the end of the concession. So I think most African governments should take that very seriously. When investors, IPPs will build these grids out for them, operate it, maintain it at a
What's
very...
the holdup? It's the model that Latin America, other parts of the world use
100%.
successfully. What's the challenge especially? What's the especially...
I think there's some nervousness about privatization in the rest of the government. Are you privatizing a national grid? It's not a real risk, and I think people has to unpack that. It's handed over back to the state at the end of the concession, still belongs to the government.
Build, operate, transfer.
Yes.
Yeah. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, no, I think so. It is something I'm seeing a lot more. Government are realizing that they can't borrow off their balance sheet. So they need to find a solution for transmission. So the IPT model, similar to what's been done in the IPP, is something that we're seeing and I see that people need to consider. So there's an element of capacity building within government to understand what an IPT involves, setting up an IPP or an IPT type office. So I think that's one. The other one is there isn't a lot of developers out there that understand the transmission space. So it's also about how can you attract more developers into Africa to try and help with the shortage of skill set that does exist. From our perspective, we set up another business in 2018 called GridWorks. And the idea there was for GridWorks to be a developer, investor, and operator of transmission assets. And today we're currently working with the government of Mozambique, the government of Uganda, to try and bring IPT models into market that can then be replicated across the continent of Africa.
Terrific. Okay, we're just out of time, so I'm going to stop there. But I think you'll all agree we had some excellent contributions from our thoughtful presenters, really got beneath the skin of the subject. No final answers, but I think we've gotten a lot to work on. So let's roll up our sleeves and give them a round of applause for taking our questions. Thank you, gentlemen.